Sahana vavatu, sahano bhunaktu, sahaviryang karavavahai, tejaspina vadhitamastu, ma vidvishavahai. Om Shanti, Shanti, Shanti. So far, we have discussed between verse 5 to 18, and it generally consisted of 5 sections. The first section was defining the 3 gunas. Then we talked about what are their effects while living. How do we identify them? What are their effects after life? And we wanted to bring these 5 sections to get us to know a little bit about these 3 gunas, especially in practicality, because at the end of the day, it is a model that can be used, and as I said, to fall back on. So considering these 5 sections are completed, we will be moving on to verse 19 to 27. And the natural question will be now, having gone through these traits and how they bind the individual, how they bind you and I, how do we release ourselves from these gunas? And while listening, I want us to take this personally, because this is not an academic discussion about what these gunas are and how they're supposedly out there and they're kind of controlling and governing everything. It's really a model that you can use or to help you to discern the nature of reality, satyam and mithya. So I thought I'd get a new chart, which is behind us. And this chart will again present us with 2 sections. Okay, and the first section will be the top section. Okay, and then we have the bottom section. The first section of chapter 14 generally talked about the bottom half. It talked about what are the qualities and attributes of a, as you can see at the bottom, of a samsaric mind. And a samsaric mind is whereby we have a predominance of rajaguna and tamaguna. So this is why if you look at this circle, and this circle indicates our samskaras. We saw in the previous charts that the samskaras are in the causal body and they are made of the 3 gunas. Now suppose that we are looking at a common hardworking man or female, and we look into their mind. What is going on in reference to these 3 gunas? Well, we will first see that everyone has the outer circle, which is called the vasanas or the samskaras. You're probably wondering what's the difference between samskara and vasana. Vasana in Sanskrit means impression of a specific type. For example, you have a way to communicate towards your mom, dad, sister, brother, boss, authority, child. So there's different ways of communicating to each member. However, and that's called vasana. However, in and through all of that, there is a way of communicating towards all of them. It could be, for example, a gentle person, a patient person. Now that way which penetrates all of the members, that's called a samskara. So samskara is a deeper impression that represents the theme of how you do something. Whereas a vasana is a more specific. So for example, there is a vasana to speak towards Meena, and there's a vasana to speak towards, for example, David, right? So they're going to be different vasanas depending on what I know about them in the past, on our relationship before. However, in and through all of that, I will communicate towards Meena in a kind way. I will also communicate towards David also in a kind way. That means I will listen, I'll see what they have to say. Now that listening is not only for Meena and David, it's also for everyone else. That's called a samskara. So vasana is specific and a samskara is more diffused, that colors the whole theme of that particular area. So For a samsaric mind, we can see that if you observe the red and the black, then black represents the tamaguna, and the red represents the rajaguna. They are dominant. That means they are in their larger proportion. So this means the samskaras or the vasanas are larger proportion than the sattva guna. Now, if you think about what does this mean? What do we say about samskaras or vasanas? We said that they are past impressions. That means the way that we have conducted our life in the past, the way that we have repeated certain habits, they form our vasanas. By them being formed is how our subtle body, which is the second circle inside, is colored in, as you can see. So however much there is of these sattvic vasanas is exactly that much of how sattvic your actual mind will be, how sattvic your actual thoughts will be. However much rajaguna habits, impressions, samskaras there are in the causal body, is as much of those rajasic thoughts that we will experience in our minds. However much tamaguna, lazy habits from the past that we have, of unwilling to participate, unwilling to engage, unwilling to contribute, is exactly how many corresponding thoughts of that nature we will have in our minds. Is that clear so far? Okay, so remember, it's very important to understand this. You do not think. We think. Oh, it's my thoughts. But we already said your thoughts are only on the basis of the past. Now, that past that I'm referring to, that is what's called your causal body, which consists of the three gunas. So, for example, you're listening right now. Now, suppose you're listening and there's an agitation about it, like disagreement. That agitation is corresponding to the Raja guna in the causal body, some resistance. And therefore, it colors in your subtle body, that is your antakarana, the mind. And therefore, there is resistance to what is. This is called lack of objectivity. I see what I want to see. It's called projecting and not what is actually happening right now. Same thing with the tamaguna. If we have certain habits of passive listening, passive listening versus active listening, what's the difference? Passive listening is next, new video, please, new video, please, new book, please, I'm done, next chapter, please, no thinking. Why? Because there is an association, or the way the person has done it before is going to color the way I listen, the way I read, the way I assimilate this vision of oneness. So you can really start to see how important it is to start developing sattva guna based habits, as is true for, as we can see in the top half, for a jnani who has done a lot of hard work on their mind, and therefore they have reduced the rajaguna. That is why it's a little bit there, and they have reduced their tamaguna thinking patterns by this much. Therefore, even though their mind is largely yellow, which means sattva guna, they still have a little bit of rajaguna. They still have a little bit of tamaguna. So this is important to understand, because we often hear notions that a Jivanmukta, the Jnani, is somehow in this blissful, amazing, perfect state. But that actually contradicts reality, because we have said, satya mithya, as long as there is a body mind, the three gunas will be functional for whomever, whether it is a sattvic mind or whether it is a mind that has firmly ascertained itself as itself, whereby the intellect, the mind, are doing the bidding of the self. In other words, they're absorbed inwards onto that, because of which I get to be aware. That means I get to be aware of the intellect. There's awareness of the mind. There's awareness of the individual. Whereas for the samsaric mind, what happens? See these arrows, how they're pointing outwards? They're always pointing towards an object. That's why we call them a samsaric mind, looking for objects. They're called binding vasanas. What is a binding vasana? So for example, it says binding vasana here, and it says looking for objects. You can see we're a torchlight. In other words, I'm looking for an object out there because, see how it says desire, I want? Now, what is a rajaguna? It is a force of agitation. Whenever we feel pain in our lives, agitated, depressed, annoyed, we want it to be better, disappointed. Why is that the case? That is because the natural state of my mind, of your mind, of everyone's mind is sattva guna based. Like babies, you look into their eyes, it's clear, pure, clear mind. Nothing's going on yet, not yet, but it evolves very soon. Now, when the Raja guna, past impression called a vasana, infiltrates and thus colors in the antakarana with Raja guna correlative thinking, thus me starting to think in that correlative way, then what happens? It agitates that natural state of the mind. And what is the natural state of the mind? Purity. And purity means what? Stillness, like a pond, no ripples. The moment Rajaguna comes in, it's like throwing a pebble into the pond. And thus the entire mind starts to ripple. And then what do? Next step, we try to get rid of it. And that's why we call it I desire. I desire to what? I desire to get that which is coloring my mind so that once I get it, that will temporarily subside. Go back into the causal body. It's not gone, is it? Go back into the causal body of Rajaguna. Thus, I can experience peace. Why does a person do the same thing over and over again? Why not make love once? And that's it. Okay, cool. I know what it's like. Let's move on. Why not, for example, ski, like ski slope or something once? Why not play a soccer match once? Why not something do that you enjoy once? Because once I do it, I suppress that agitation. It's like a mosquito bite, right? Once it comes, it's like a mosquito bite. It bites the mind. And then what do we do with the mosquito bite? Do we just kind of go, okay, cool, nice? No, we want to scratch it. Why? Because we want to temporarily relieve ourselves from that scratch. Just like that, when a Rajaguna starts to color in the mind, the mosquito of Rajaguna bites the sattvic pure mind and naturally want to rub ourselves with that object. And that is why we call it looking for objects so that I can rub it and that it can recede at least temporarily. And thus I can enjoy my natural state of contentment. Whereas we have for the Jnani, if we look at their just general disposition, we can see it says looking at the self. What is looking at the self? The intellect. That's why it's introverted. That means the intellect has trained itself to constantly recognize that because of which things are known onto this individual. And thus we can see majority of yellow, and then obviously we've got a little bit of black and we've got a little bit of red. So, and we call this samadhi. Now, samadhi has two definitions. In the Yoga Patanjali Sutra, samadhi, it is a specific time-bound place and a state that is experienced temporarily through the through yama, niyama. You have to go through your lifestyle. You have to live the right thoughts, the right values, the right dharma. And then we're going to train your body to sit in the meditation pose. That's why we have asana. And then we talk about, get your breathing right, because the breathing directly affects your thoughts. So we go pranayama. And then we say, start to now withdraw inside. It's called pratyahara. And then we say, look for a certain object that you can focus on. It's called dharana. And then we say, okay, now having the dharana there for a moment, now you naturally go into a state of meditation. That means everything else starts to fade away. That's dhyanam. And once everything starts to fade away for some moments, maybe a few minutes, then the mind naturally forgets about its environment. And that's what we call samadhi. And in that samadhi, the purpose of Ashtanga Yoga, the 8-step process, is so that the individual can at least temporarily, quote, sense or experience, like literally experience in their BMI, in their body, mind, intellect, the state whereby what is it like to have a pure mind without any of this agitation coming in, without any of these vasanas starting to color in the mind with their ignorance and with their agitations. And thus the person gets really inspired by the purity of this samadhi. And thus when they get out of it, it then helps them to pursue this journey further, invigorates them all over again. So say, yes, this is what I want. And so they pursue that. Now that is Yoga Patanjali Sutra definition of samadhi. When it comes to Advaita Vedanta samadhi, it is different. It's not like one's sitting or maintaining themselves in a state through efforts, because the problem is not lack of action. The problem is ignorance. And to remove myself, to remove the person that I think I am, the upadhi, the superimposition that is covering the self, what do I have to do? I have to remove these false notions that are constantly coloring in the antakarana. So it's important to understand this. For whom is moksha? Is it for Atman? Okay, good. For whom is moksha? It is for the mind. That is it. Because the mind is always being pervaded in and through by awareness. It's never not pervaded. But the mind keeps on projecting notions that it's not. I am not that. And therefore it denies it. It says, no, it's an experience. I want it to be something. It has to be some kind of an amazing experience. And thus it keeps on rejecting, and therefore it's unable to own up. So this is why in Vedanta we keep on saying, moksha is nothing but owing up to what is true right now. What is ever true right now. What was true yesterday, what is true today, and what is true tomorrow. And what is that? You. Who is always available to oneself? You are. When are you not available to yourself? Never. That presence, because of which you are, I am, that is what we call Atman, the self. So what Vedanta does is simply clears up these notions that I'm not experiencing myself already right now. And thus it says, what is enlightenment like? What is moksha like? So my counter to that is, how can you even ask that? Because you exist, do you not? You are you not? Right? In other words, I am. I am never not. I always am as I am. Existence, awareness. And therefore, it is simply owing up to the simple truth that the mind keeps on resisting. So again, these two halves will, in summary, show us what chapter 14 is trying to communicate. And now, having done verse 5 to 18, which mentions the lower half, we're now going to proceed onto the upper half of the Jivanmukta. And finally, want to close, as we can see, when the samsaric mind gets a little bit of joy of sattva guna, it experiences happy thoughts. Therefore, it says, I am happy, it smiles. When there's a predominance of these samskaras, and therefore they color in the mind with rajaguna, what does the mind say? I want, right? I'm not happy as I am right now. I want more friends, I want more fame, I want a partner, I want this, I want that. It just never ends because these vasanas are literally infinite. And then, of course, when the tamaguna starts to come in, then we experience fear. I don't want. In other words, I feel I'm going to lose out, and therefore I want to then pursue. So these two gunas are always together. So this chapter 14 is about managing our gunas so that we do not constantly fall for rajaguna, tamaguna, but also, as we said, sattva guna. They're all binding, right? Sattva guna wants to know. It's never happy with the knowledge that it receives. It always wants another video. It wants another swami. It wants another guru. It's just cannot settle. It cannot own up to the simple fact that I am. Rajaguna always wants to act, wants to do something, right? Moving about. So it's hard to settle because it's moving so that it can temporarily recede this painful energy of the Rajaguna. Tamaguna is binding. How so? Sleep, right? Too much rest. Right? It's like, why are you resting all the time? How can you be so tired, right? Oh, I am tired. Well, do something. And so karma yoga, again, in chapter 3, is about receding this tamaguna, because as I said, in the beginning years, we start out with plenty of tamaguna. So karma yoga simply takes you out into the world and then increases the rajaguna of yourself, or maybe your child or your friend, so that you can kind of, get out of this low, pulling down, heavy energy that doesn't allow us to shine, doesn't allow us to live a meaningful life. And then once we have done enough of action, then we can start to reflect upon what has happened. And this reflection takes the form of a sattva-guna, which starts to, as a result of that reflection, starts to increase the amount. So you're wondering, how does the person get here, right? How do they go from the samsaric mind, from these three gunas, whereby Raja and Tama are dominant? How did it go from there into here? And the answer is always going to be the same. It is just practice. Because as long as I subordinate to Raja Guna, the ratio of that Raja is going to stay exactly the same. So every time we get something that is opposed to something of those 20 values that we talked about in the last chapter, then you apply what's called Pratipaksha Bhavana. Does someone remember what Pratipaksha Bhavana is? Would you like to tell me? Pratipaksha Bhavana.
Provide the opposite, the counter thought to that thought. Yeah.
Good, excellent. So you can see, as Nagesh has just mentioned, it is actually effort. However, it's something so simple, and yet we just completely leave it alone. We just go along with our annoyance. For example, we see the news and we get annoyed, right? Now, instead of getting annoyed, you actually need to interrupt that pattern. You say, well, let me try to understand a different point of view so I'm not so agitated by what's going on. Let me try to understand the whole picture. And that takes some time. And every time you apply that, you're actually inducing more and more of this sattva guna. So the ultimate purpose here is to have this beautiful mind where it's clear, it is lucid, it knows what it wants next, when it wants it, how it wants it, what it doesn't want, and it doesn't get confused by the bombardment of so many advertisements that come from different directions through the course of our lives, right? So in other words, we're always sharp and lucid and attuned to and sensitive to the realities. And that involves the increase of this sattva guna, whereby it is always focused towards that which I am, the self. Okay, so this is a little intro, and I think we can continue now, verse 19, unless you got some questions.
Just so that I understand clearly, when you're talking about pratibhakshika, when you're trying to do the opposite to gain more, for example, sattva guna. So I think last week or the week before, you were mentioning not to actively do it, you know. So you don't actively do it because you're not forcing it on you. I'm just trying to get the clarity around when does it become force and when does it become, you know, more of a natural progression.
Sure. So remember those 4 levels of thinking that we talked about, and the level 3 was really deliberate thinking. Right, level 1 was impulsive and level 2 was just mechanical. But then level 3 was whereby we are deliberately thinking it. So this is where we're deliberately applying Pratipaksha Bhavana. Now, why deliberate? Because it is a natural place of someone with this kind of mind. It's happening in the background. Now, what was after stage 3? We said after deliberate thinking, after some time, it is spontaneous thinking. So yes, at the beginning, there is certainly that maybe even unpleasant effort, right? It's like, why do I need to now, you know, think, and I can just get on with what's going on. But just think about what are you losing out on? You're losing out on future peace, because if we get our minds right now, then we actually only enjoy the immense benefits in the future. So the way I look at it is, you know, suppose you want to learn a language, right? Or you want to learn dancing. I don't know what you like. Maybe you want to learn how to be a good cook or something. And in those few first, let's say 1 year, it's actually a pain, right? To learn and to memorize and to figure it out and make mistakes. And maybe your chef is spanking you or something, or you know, it's not enjoyable, right? But then only once we've done it for some time, it actually starts to slowly become more and more enjoyable. And when does it become enjoyable? When we can let go of that deliberate thinking. But we can only let go of that deliberate thinking, and we only start to enjoy because we have gone through the pain of doing it initially. And anyone, for example, who's learning something new, maybe a new language, maybe some new skill, you will know exactly what I'm talking about. It is actually not so pleasant in those beginning years. There's a ballerina called Fontaine in the 1930s, I think. Could be wrong, 1950s, 40s.
Margot Fontaine.
Ah, good. Yeah. So she was one of the greatest ballerinas so far that we know. And, you know, she was once asked, you know, tell us your story. How did you get to this place of this graceful movement? You're just so lost in your art. And she says something like, you know, if you saw my story, I was just doing grueling work day in and day out, constantly practicing, falling down, blood, right? Sometimes a pain, I had to stay home, wear bandages, come back, trip over, grueling, hard work. So initially it was hard work, but now she's just in that stage 4 thinking, spontaneous. Same thing here. This is spontaneous. At the beginning, it is painful. I get it. It is not so pleasant.
Sorry, I have a question. Thank you. It's a little thing that you alluded to earlier, and it doesn't happen all the time. As I'm progressing with my understanding and trying to apply the teachings and the learnings, I think what I feel I'm losing out, maybe I'm feeling a bit tamasic, is that I feel I have less in common with the people that I used to have so much, and it feels weird because they are dear friends, but I just don't seem to have the same interest in things that I used to enjoy with them so much. The chatter and all that stuff.
Sure. Yeah,
it's just a thing, I guess. But I just noticed it, and it's not going to stop me. But I just noticed that because I don't want to feel alienated or on my own, or I don't know.
In the scriptures, it says something very nice. If you want to get married, and I'll transfer this onto what you're saying, then do not look for character traits of the person, because those character traits are based on their stage of life. And those character traits will change as they change, as the stages that are pertinent and meaningful to that person. So if we fall in love with the traits of the person, the actual personality, then we're probably just going to disappoint ourselves in the future, because that person's swadharma, their duty and their love for different things will modify. So the scriptures say what you actually focus on when looking for a marriage partner is something deeper, the deeper core values. Those core values do not change as often as their interests or their traits do. You look for morals. What morals do they follow? What do they admire about life? Do they have moral understanding? What values do they follow? And thus I can now connect with something much deeper that's going to hold us as the person's role changes through the course of the years. So just like that, the friends that we connect with initially, they can sometimes be those who are, in a sense of, they're meaningful to us in that moment. However, we haven't really taken the time to look at what values do we share, right? So one of the friends that I have is from 2001, and we don't really have much in common because he's into pseudo-spirituality, into all sorts of energy healing and chakra balancing and all of that stuff that I've been through many years ago. But the question is, why are we still friends? And we're still friends because we still have this underlying accommodation, this value for just listening to each other and not having this need to judge each other at all. And therefore, this deeper value is what holds us despite our character traits being completely 180 degrees different. So those people that slowly leave out of our presence tend to be associated with those traits rather than those deeper values. Okay, so
why do we have Maya at the center in samsaric mind and not the Atma?
So you can see here that Meena has a very sharp eye. She's noticing certain details. So they're the same circles. On the top, it is the self. It's the Brahman shining through the body-mind. From the reference of Mithya, we call that Atman. Now, Atman is also shining here. It's illuminating this mind. It's illuminating the character traits, the values, and the thinking. However, because a lack of education on the part of the individual, they know not that what is illuminating is actually me, the self. But what they say, what is illuminating is me, the self, but the body, mind, intellect. In other words, it's still the self, but it's the self in the form of the body, mind, intellect. Whereas here, that word of self has completely changed. The identity has gone from BMI, if you're probably even going to notice this now, Nina, BMI, body, mind, intellect. The body is the perceiver of what? Of objects. The mind is the feeler of what? Emotions. The intellect is the thinker of what? Thoughts. Now, this BMI is true here. This BMI is true here because both of us are wearing costumes. Jnani is wearing a costume. Ajnani is wearing a costume. Except that Ajnani's costume is recognized to be the sole source of my sentiency, whereas the Jnani's costume is clearly recognized to be not self. Thus, the Ajnani, the non-wise person, is being tricked by Maya, so to speak, tricked.
You mentioned that the guna teaching is something that we fall back on. Why is that more than any other framework that we look at?
Two reasons, because number one, the gunas are specific. So when we look at the colorful world, we can now apply some colors, and we can apply yellow, red, and we can apply black. And I don't just mean literally, but I mean through understanding. The second is when you're in a confronting situation or in a situation that just takes your mind away for a moment, then it's too late by then. So you better have something to understand what is going on. What is this confusing phenomena that I am baffled, that I am bedazzled by? What is the source of that confusing phenomenon? It is Prakriti, we get it. But if you want to get more specific, you say, well, see, there's projection there is ignorance there, and there is knowledge there. And they're always working together, they're always mixed. And thus it allows the mind, when it loses itself for a moment, when its intellect is suppressed, to instantly fall back onto this vision of Prakriti.
Yeah, I think he was saying that I had trouble understanding as well, but what I did get, he was experiencing the world as an illusion. Even whilst he was talking to people, the whole thing seemed to have an unreality about it. He was trying to address that.
See, this unreal and real is a preliminary understanding. It is not the final understanding. There is no such thing as unreal. It's only real. Satyam alone is. Brahman alone is. That is the final understanding. So when you say unreal, what do I mean by that? For example, you take a clay pot. The clay is, quote, real, but the pot is also real. It's only real while it's real. The moment you change or you break that pot, then it's no longer that name and form. It's no longer, quote, real, but it's still the pot in pieces. It's still the clay. So when you say the word unreal, what it really just means, it's that which is changing, the modification of the content, the changing of that clay, the waves that are within the scope of the ocean. In other words, everything's ultimately real. You just have to discern what is that which is unchanging and what is that which is changing. And also when it comes to about the world, like the world is unreal, careful. The world is not apart from this person who is saying that. Because when we say the world, we usually exclude this body, mind, intellect. So we have to catch ourselves there. When you say the world, you're actually including this body, mind, intellect. So thus, the world is unreal. Wait a minute. The world is satyam, right? The world is mithya, but wherever mithya is, that's exactly where satyam is also at the same time. Keep that in mind.
Yeah, psychologically, people that experience the world as unreal suffer from alienation. So you answer that in what you just said. They see it as other than themselves.
Yeah, it is. That's good, Robert. You brought that up. It is unfortunate to discard the world as unreal, because then I don't get involved, and not getting involved, I just sustain my Rajaguna and my Tamaguna, right? See, to get involved, what is the nature of Ishvara? Because what do we say about Maya? I'll tell you why to get involved, because the whole chapter, the whole Bhagavad Gita teaching is, having heard this, now go, Arjuna, go into the field, do your duty. What is the nature of Maya? Pure Sattva Guna. And Maya is that which moves about this world, that which makes everything happen. Maya is the giver of everything. You want it? Here, my child, says Ishvara. Oh, Maya, it's the same thing. You want this? Here, my child, have it. You want to go there? Here, my child, have it. You want to think like that? Here, my child, think like that. So the more you align yourself to Ishvara's giving, to Ishvara's contribution, the more you increase this Sattva Guna. And now imagine Ishvara says, no, it's an unreal world, so what's the point of giving? So just like that, we need to catch ourselves, not to deny giving to the world, because then we just reduce the Sattva Guna. The more you give of yourself, the more you contribute, this is called your swadharma, your talents, your strengths, the more you increase this yellow Sattva Guna in your mind. Yeah. And this can only come if one does not keep on discarding the world as unreal, translating that into an excuse to not help, to not participate. That's the danger point, Robert.
Yeah, look, I make this point not to criticize the chap that's been, because I've done this myself when I was younger, in particular. If you experience that sort of alienation, you can fall for a sort of subtle sense of superiority where you feel that you're not, subject to that unreality. You're sitting outside it and above it. And the loneliness is almost more like a badge of honor. it's a very subtle deception.
Very
and
subtle.
quite damaging.
Yeah, very subtle and hard to catch. And that's a good point. And this is why we need someone to give us feedback, because we cannot see our own blind spots, because we are the blind spot. When I say we, I'm talking about the mind intellect. Therefore, we need someone to feed back to us where are we potentially making a mistake. And this is why I say, it's the four graces have to come together to really get this fully. And that is one's own effort, Ishwara's grace, Guru's grace, and also the methodology. In fact, it is Ishwara's grace, the one that puts the glue that puts the other three together. And how do you gain Ishwara's grace? I just said, by aligning yourself with the whole. And what is the nature of the whole? To contribute, to give according to one's strength, openly, freely, right? Whatever it is, however small. And thus that builds that Ishwara grace, and that makes the mind more and more fit for self-knowledge, Brahma Vidya, to take hold firmly. That's why we call it self-actualized. It's not just self-realized. Okay, cool. I realize I'm unchanging. Cool. Let's go home. Self-actualized. What's the difference? Self-actualized means it's actual, right now, unbroken understanding, right? And all of that comes through that prior work, donations, charity, and just pratipaksha bhavana, applying the opposite for a while until this becomes normal, to exercise some forgiveness, some empathy for what we would otherwise put into the box of bad, right? A very shallow box called bad or evil or something. Doesn't require much thinking to put things into box of bad, but it does require a lot of thinking to look at what could be the cause of this, what could be their story that's causing them to do this. Nanyam gunebhyah kartaram yada drashtanupashyati gunebhyascha param veti madbhavam sodhigacchati.
When the seer does not see an agent other than the gunas, and when he knows himself as beyond the gunas, he gains, understands my nature.
Gunan etan tityatrin dehi deha samudbhavan janma mrityu jara dukkaihi vimukto mrittamashnute.
Crossing these three gunas that are the cause of the body, the embodied one, released from birth, death, old age, and sorrow, gains immortality.
Arjuna uvacha kairlingai stringunan etan atito bhavati prabho kimachara katham chaitan stringunan ativartate.
Arjuna said, "O Lord, by what characteristics does a person become recognizable as one who has crossed these three gunas? What is his conduct, and how does he transcend these three gunas?"
Sri Bhagavan uvacha prakasham cha pravrittim cha mohameva cha pandava nadveshti sampravrittani nanivartani kankshati. Robert?
Sri Bhagavan said, Pandava, Arjuna, brightness and activity and even delusion that have come to occur, he does not despise, nor does he long for those who have gone away.
Verse 19 to 27 will talk about how to free oneself from this guna hold. In other words, what's called the features of a guna titaha. Guna titaha, that means the one free of the three gunas. Guna titaha. So when we say guna titaha, it's just like in chapter 2, sthita prajna, the one that is whose intellect is firm, or Jnani or Jivanmukta. So verse 19, reading from that list. Verse, as one effortlessly and consistently recognizes self being different from the three gunas, one is considered wise and enjoys immortality therefrom. Okay, so far the verse 5 to 18 has pointed out how each guna binds us. And sattva guna, for example, demands knowledge. It demands lots of research into things, and it makes us very busy intellectually, innovation. And in fact, all of the innovators are sattva guna based. Einstein, Thomas, Nikola Tesla, Ramanujan, highly sattvic, and thus able to produce this amazing work. However, it can be binding in reference to spirituality. Rajaguna is binding in terms of activity or movement. We have the need to do, to go, to constantly be involved in things, to watch, to just really be busy. and not have time on ourselves, on our own thinking. Then tamaguna demands sleep and inertia. So not wanting to, as I said, get involved or finding an excuse, as Robert was saying, to hold back one's light to the world. That is tamaguna there. And all these three gunas, sattva guna, raja guna, tamaguna, they are, as we've seen here, that which produces our likes and dislikes in the form of I want something that's going to make me happy, and I don't want that which is going to make me fearful. So this forces us to assume a doer, because whenever a guna comes, then it compels the mind to act accordingly. Now, what does that do? It makes me a doer, a karta. Now, can a karta not do? No, a karta is going to do. Otherwise, you'll be like, something's wrong with me, right? So the moment you're a karta, you're automatically a Mr. or Mrs. Bhakta, right? You want to be an enjoyer of the actions that me, this body, mind, intellect, am putting out into the field. And so karta equals bhakta, and bhakta equals karta. So it's a cycle that they feed each other. Now, what is the solution? Now, the solution for these three guna bondage, and that is to transcend the gunas, as the verse is saying. Now, how do we transcend the gunas? We can't do it within mithya. So in other words, there's no technique that you can prescribe to transcend the gunas. You can only recognize that you are already free of these three gunas. You're the unchanging presence in whose presence these three gunas do what they do in the form of this person called your name. You're the presence in whose presence these three gunas in the form of maybe agitation comes, maybe in the form of knowledge, love comes, maybe in the form of mistakes comes. In other words, you can start to see how beautiful this understanding, this model upon which we can fall back on, starts to become. No longer do we take things so personally, because this person called your name is going or undergoing through these conditionalities on the basis of these three gunas. So no longer do we say, oh, I'm ignorant. I don't know, I'm not, I'm a, whatever, a loser or something, or I am so bright. This is just guna you're talking about. Coming and going for one single person. That's just you, never mind someone else, your neighbor or something. In other words, transcending really just means through knowledge, understanding, I am the unchanging presence, unchanging awareness in whose presence the changing gunas are coming and going and expressing through this body, mind, intellect. The one that is perceiving, the one that is feeling, the one that is thinking. The perceiver, I am not. The thinker, I am not. The feeler of emotions, I am not. All of this, I am not. And this is, as Gayatri was saying, initially hard work, right? Maybe painful, but eventually becomes stage number 4, thinking spontaneous, and that's automatic. Kshetra, kshetrajna. Prakriti, purusha. Atma, anatma. So it's a discernment between that. How to transcend. Step 1. Understand you are other than the three gunas. In other words, identify the effects of the three gunas. This is why we're told you in the effects between verse 5 and 18, because unless you know the effects, how can you discern? I need to know that which I am discerning from that which remains, my presence. So first is identify the effects of the three gunas in reference to, quote, transcending. The second is start to, not verbally, but even you can say it verbally, but you need to understand, what do you mean when you say this? You say, I am not a body with consciousness. I'm not a person or a jiva with consciousness. Right? I'm not just this much bound by the edges with consciousness. Rather, I am the consciousness with an incidental body that is modified by the presence of these three gunas. I am awareness with an incidental body given by Bhagavan, according to the samskaras given to this individual that is now listening, that is now speaking, they are playing out through. And me being the awareness, I am watching and going along with whatever is going on, in accordance with dharma, in accordance with values, because going with values increases the sattva guna. In my presence, Prakriti does everything. In my presence, all of this is done. Results, actions, pains, pleasures, successes, failures, cheers, depressions, ups, downs, These are three guna qualities, colorings, expressing through this body, being felt through this body, perceived by this body-mind, thought by this body-mind. In the presence of me, the Purusha, this Prakriti, these three gunas are undergoing whatever they're undergoing all the time. In fact, they're never not undergoing as long as there is a body-mind alive. Furthermore, for the sake of transactions, going back to Robert, you fully engage in those transactions. In other words, the common question is, how do I practice this when I'm working? See, suppose you have a crucial job, right? Suppose you're a pilot, and now you take they say the most important moment is when you're landing. And now you're landing, you're going, okay, let me just remember, okay, I'm the presence in whose presence the knowledge of pilot or aviation is known. Oh, let me get back to my aviation, protocol. In other words, you just put that aside for a moment and you do your role, right? Fully, congruently. After you finish your role, continue your studies, continue your self-inquiry. Bring not this knowledge in crucial moments, okay? Otherwise, the plane crashes, okay? And that's bad. Box called bad now. So play the role fully. Once the role is over, get back into your self-inquiry. And so you alternate between this and that. And eventually, through your alternations, through the course of time, it becomes integrated. It's automatic. It's the tune of self-knowledge is singing in the background, whatever you're doing, constant. Okay, verse 20, reading now. Obtaining in self as self while living, upon death, self remains beyond the gunas and permanently enjoys one's limitlessness. So this is talking about Brahma Vidya. What is the benefit of self-knowledge, of Brahma Vidya, of actualized Brahma Vidya? The first benefit is one, having done their past inquiry, learns to discern Atma, Anatma, Purusha, Prakriti, Kshetram, Kshetrajna. Okay, in other words, the unchanging presence and the changing three guna model. One learns to just automatically discern that spontaneously. One also remembers that the body-mind is a temporary blessing of the Lord. This is important because if you take Lord out of the equation, this thing simply doesn't stick. In fact, it's safe to say God alone is your glue to this knowledge sticking. And this is where humility comes in. And this is why one cannot just say, oh, okay, so all of this is unreal. That doesn't work. One needs to still have that sense of, because humility is a natural state, right? One still says, hey, Lord, may this knowledge firm up. Lord, may this be more clear and lucid, whereby it's totally clear as daylight for me at any moment. Right, so one still brings devotion, one still brings bhakti, one still brings prayer, one still brings their religious rites, their pujas and japas and chanting and singing and kirtanam. So there's a variety in one's life. And this variety is not a waste of time. This variety is just an expression of sattva guna, your love for the whole, and the whole is the Lord, the whole is Bhagavan. So we bring the Lord in, and this body being blessed by the Lord, because of that alone, this person gets to ascertain who he or she is. In other words, you only get to ascertain the knowledge of yourself as yourself, being other than the three gunas, because of who? None other than the Lord. Therefore, Lord is number one in one's life. There's no question of leaving God out of the picture. And this is the advantage of Vedanta. It brings in God, whereas some other systems that will just pull God out, and it becomes a very dry life. Actually, there's nothing to hold on to. Being blessed by the Lord, at the same time recognizing I'm other than this body. If I associate with this body, if I mistake myself to be this body, then what happens? The body's problems become whose problems? My problems. Atman's problems. In other words, as long as Atman self is placed in the body, mind, intellect, if the body gets scratched, who got scratched? I got scratched. Just when you buy a new car or a motorcycle, whatever it is, right? One little scratch, right? It's game over, right? It's a big deal, right? But then 1 year later, they get scratched again, and it's like, okay, so what, right? So in other words, if we place identity in the body, mind, intellect, then the death of the body, mind, intellect becomes whose death? Atman's death. And therefore, Atman gets to wear another body, mind next life. The birth, the death of the body-mind intellect equals the birth of the body-mind intellect. And since I am still associated to such, then I, Brahman or Atman, get reborn and therefore new life. So as I said before, the purpose of Vedanta is to simply remove the notions. I am other than this changing principle of the body-mind intellect governed by these three gunas. This is practice. It's not a one-off. It's not like, oh, okay, cool. Let me wait for the moment. Cool. Okay, so Andre or whoever is saying this, so it's going to happen one day. It starts right now. I'm literally saying this is practice. And therefore we get into hard work practice, efforts. That's one of those 4 graces. Not going, oh, okay, Ishwara, let me pray, and then a bag of, whatever moksha comes onto one's head. You know everything. So someone said a very beautiful quote. If a person spends as much time building a company as they spend into knowing thyself, basically everyone would be liberated. But we simply don't do that. We are excellent at building a company, at building a report, at certain topics of the worldly nature, excellent at that. And we put heart and soul into it. But if you transfer that equal amount of time onto this knowledge, everyone would be liberated by now. It's simple as that, really. So it's really hard work. Okay. Now, let me remind you what it means to get a body, just in case you are thinking, okay, maybe next life, To be born, first 9 months, you get solitary confinement. Okay, so in other words, you're locked up and you're having a little whatever happening inside. And then after birth, you get to cry, and then you get to be dependent upon your mom or dad, right? Maybe you slip, you trip over, you fall, you're disappointed how everyone else is God, especially parents, they're God to the little one. But me alone, I do not know. Because I do not know, I form self-esteem issues because everyone else knows, but I don't know. So I take it personally. And so self-esteem issues start very early on, even before one gets to speak. And then as the person grows up, they go through, as we said before, disease, right? Aging, disappointment, maintenance. They get caught up, enmeshed, and then ultimately sickness, and then old age, and then death, right? And then just repeat the whole process. So really consider this, right? It's not just a joke, but it's really something worthy of considering in case there's a temptation. Oh, this world is so cool. You cannot attribute this world to that which is limitless, and you are limitless. Who wants limited versus limitlessness? Nobody. Therefore, one has to claim that. How? By constantly reminding oneself, I am not the body with consciousness. I am consciousness in whose presence this body, being governed by the 3 gunas, is. I also want to remind you what it means to develop a clear Atma Anatma Viveka. It means having a sense of objectivity. What does objectivity mean? It means I'm seeing the facts as they are. I'm seeing exactly what's going on right now, and there's no sense of projection. A lack of objectivity means a Raja Guna dominant mind is projecting, and thus it cannot align with what's going on. And what is this objective in reference to? That the body goes through the decay process, it goes through the death process, and it gets reborn. It's Prakriti, it is not self, it is limited, it is not unlimited, it has conditions, and those conditions are subject to limitations. And you are not limitation, you are that which is limitless. Therefore, by understanding that I am much bigger than this body-mind, careful, do not necessarily say I am not the body-mind. Rather, it's better to say I'm much more than this body-mind, because that in actuality is true. Being much more than this body-mind, it becomes a very strong coping solution, actually. In fact, it becomes the ultimate psychological coping solution. Because psychology, for example, if you think about it, it only deals with parts, right? But it doesn't deal with the whole picture. So if you have a model to fall back on, and you understand much bigger than the body-mind who has problems and so on, then it becomes much easier to be objective towards it. And objectivity causes you to be clear and lucid, and thus get the solution much quicker, get the problem solved, rather than complaining or going that this is not supposed to happen right now. So we're not saying hoping as in denying, we're just saying that, hey, it's not so bad as I thought. In other words, objectivity turns big things into small things. For example, there's a symbology. Remembering the Ramayana, when Hanuman wanted to go to Lanka and save Sita, and then Hanuman suddenly increased in size, and the ocean became very small, like a pond. What is the symbology of that? What happened? What did Hanuman do before he increased in size? He took to Lord Rama. In other words, I surrendered to Ishvara. In other words, when I surrender to the truth, then big things like the Rakshasas, now they were like little mosquitoes, something as huge as the ocean turns into something as small as the pond. In other words, when I turn over, when I surrender to the truth, spontaneously, through effort, of course, through deliberate efforts, then the big things become small. And thus, because now they're small, I'm able to deal with them much more objectively. In other words, they're easier to manage. They're not so big of a deal anymore. And finally, the verse says, what's the result of this knowledge? The verse says, Amritam Ashnute. In other words, I've surrendered to Amritam, immortality. In other words, I've reclaimed my natural state, my immortal self, my Ananda. In other words, the identification has shifted. And that brings us to verse 21. Reading. Arjuna asks, what are characteristics of one who has crossed transcended the three gunas? How does he, she conduct oneself in reference to the world, people, and how does he, she go beyond them? Hearing previous verses, Arjuna is now inspired. And so he wants to ask Krishna 3 questions in this verse. And there are similar questions to chapter 2. Arjuna was asking about sthita prajna. Sthita means firm and prajna means knowledge, and it was firm knowledge. I want to know about one who has firm knowledge, one whose intellect is firmly looking, as it says here, looking at the self, right? Recognizing the self. Tell me about him or her. And more like, tell me about that mind. It's not about him, it's not about gender, but tell me about that mind. And question 1, what Arjuna is asking is, what are the characteristics of one who has crossed or transcended the 3 gunas? This will be verse 22 to 23. We're in verse 21 now. In other words, is there any change in their body? Do they become slim? Do they become bigger? Are they now have a little halo over their head, right? Do they change their clothing? Do they walk in a certain way? Do they change their, do they shave off their head or whatever it is, right? So do they transform physically? That's a valid question, actually. A lot of people want to know that. Question 2 that Arjuna is asking is, how does he or she conduct oneself in reference to the world or people? And this will be mentioned in verse 24 and 25. And finally, question 3 in this verse is, how does one go beyond the gunas? Again, this will be in verse 26. Now, the last question, how does one go beyond the gunas? As I've just been saying the whole session, guna tita, in other words, the one that is free of the gunas, involves the buddhi, owing up constantly to the ever true fact. And what is that ever true fact? I am free right now. I am free right now. It's not, you're not lying to yourself. See, I'm only saying this after going through chapter 13 and 12 and 11. So much education is gone. So there's no question of now lying to oneself. So we'll have to look at the context. I am free right now, right here. And this takes time to own up constantly, constant reminder, like a salesman. You know, a salesman wants to sell you something and he's saying, no, 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 no. But he just keeps on persisting. Okay, yeah, no, here's the benefits. No, let me give you some more facts and charts and information and numbers and postulation and hypotheses. And then you keep giving your objections. No, 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 here's some other charts and numbers to counter your objections. And then, you know, eventually, oh, consider it. No, no, don't consider it. Let me show you more information, right? And he does it in 18 chapters. And eventually, the mind just turns over in one instant. Yes, I want to buy the product. In other words, yes, I've owned up to the self as the self permanently. From there on, no more seeking, no more inquiry into other postulations and other, am I missing something out? No, full. Continuing to verse 22 now, whereby we will start to answer these questions. Verse 22 will answer question 1. What are the characteristics of one who has crossed these 3 gunas? That means Jivanmukta. Reading the verse, the Lord replies, Jivanmukta hates not brightness, that is sattva guna, activity, raja, and delusion, tama, because they keep arising in the mind anyway. nor does he, she attempt to make the good qualities return after they go away. That's a big one for most of us, right? Oh, I've had an amazing experience. I wanted to come back because now I've lost my enlightenment. Big mistake. It's an experience. Anything that has a beginning has an end. That's a quote from Matrix 3. So let's start with Jivanmukta's appearances. The appearance of how one looks, how one talks, how one conducts oneself, how one goes out, what one wears, one's body remains exactly the same. It's very easy to explain why. Because there's still a mind operating, and that mind has been indoctrinated culturally, parentally, societally, and those indoctrinations will continue as much as they've always continued. Therefore, nothing changes about the person's appearance. They do not want to suddenly get leaner and slimmer and shave their heads, unless they want to present themselves to the world. There is a valid reason for that. Otherwise, there's no change in that regard. In reference to the Jivanmukta's mind, there's again, they're enjoying a level of objectivity in terms of their own body, but also their own conclusions. So in other words, there's no so much identification with one's mind's conclusions. Before, whatever I say is important. Did you hear that? It's important, right? Now, right? If I say it, if you don't get it, hey, fine, let it go, right? It's not mine anyway. It's just one of these three guna mixtures expressing through this mind. So therefore, there's no need to get attached to it. For a Jivanmukta, the buddhi, the intellect, is capable of objectifying not only the body, but also the very buddhi because of which it gets to objectify. The very buddhi that is being illumined by what we call awareness. In other words, this intellect that's going right now, I'm objectifying this buddhi. I'm even objectifying these words. But now in the background that you cannot mention because Atman is non-verbalized, you cannot communicate it. There's always knowledge because of which this buddhi gets to objectify everything else. In other words, that which illumines the buddhi objectifying everything else. We simply call it, if you're confused, subject-object. In other words, the subject is always there. And the buddhi knows that which is always there, that which is always unchanging, self, Atman. Owing to this objectivity, furthermore, things are not taken so personally. And we said a lovely phrase before in shorthand, the what's, with a big exclamation mark, what turns into so what? What into so what? Now, it's not a big deal because now, like Hanuman, I've turned myself over to the Lord, to this vast grand order. Big things are not so big anymore. Therefore, the what into so what? Okay, and this allows you to actually work with what is going on right now. More importantly, is the Jivanmukta has owned up to the fact that their mind is also dominated by sometimes Rajaguna and Tamaguna dominantly. In other words, they're completely okay with them making mistakes. They're completely okay with them not being relatively perfect. Whereas a samsari wants to constantly improve themselves. They're never happy with how much they know, right? They want to be happier. They want to be more cheerful. They want to be more out there. They want to be more exuberant, alive. Jivanmukta is completely okay with whatever's going on. Because the knowledge of that which illumines the conditionalities of the three gunas is always there, and it's firm and it's clear. In other words, the brain is always limited, as I said last week, but so is the mind. And because the brain is there, being pulled down by the neurons, by the age, by the vitamins, by the nutrients, by the level of dopamine, by serotonin, by estrogen, all of these chemicals on a biological level will pull down the mind. And because they're always operating, where is the question of constantly trying to better oneself? In fact, the older we get, our eyesight starts to lessen, our ears start to lessen, our sensitivity to the environment starts to degrade. So where's the question of constantly improving this person? I just recognize this person is going through a condition and will die one day, but the knowledge is firm. Also, the Jivanmukta, in reference to the mind, has accepted that this mind of ours is going through fluctuations. For whom are these fluctuations not going on? Nobody. Knowing this, I'm okay with leaving the mind as it is. Because the moment I change the mind, how long is that going to last? Right? Samskaras keep on pouring, keep on pouring. Therefore, the highest understanding ultimately in reference to the person is accepting yourself as you are, instead of constantly going, okay, there's one problem with me, let me go and fix myself, right? Let me go look up a book or a solution. Just being okay with the relative person. This is a shining attribute of a Jivanmukta, acceptance with one's body, with one's thoughts, no matter how erroneous or sometimes unpleasant or distasteful they are, they're okay with them. Because you just cannot get perfect in Mithya. There's no such thing as perfection in Mithya. And this is a big relief to own up to this understanding. And finally, the Jivanmukta does not chase highs anymore. They do not want those highs to last. In fact, they just let those highs be as long as they last. But once they're gone, they do not say, oh, I miss that, you know, those good old times of being so sattvic and all that. Okay, so all of that is gone, because the Jivanmukta is, you know, like everyone else, swadharma, you're busy, right? You're moving on like a snake. Once the skin is shed, you don't look back, you just move on. Udasi navadasi naha gunairyo na vichalyate guna vartanta ityeva yo vatishtati nengate samadukha sukha swastaha samaloshta kanchanaha tulya priya priyodhiraha tulya nendatma samstutihi mana pamana yostulyaha tulyo mitrari pakshayoho sarvarambha parityagi gunati taksa uchyate.
He who remaining as though indifferent is not shaken by the gunas, and he who abides in himself, thinking that the gunas alone are acting, the one who does not move from the vision of the self.
Being wise is the same with reference to pleasure and pain. Abiding in himself, the same with reference to a clod of earth, a stone or gold, the same in pleasant and unpleasant situations, the same with reference to censure or praise of himself.
Views of a friend or an enemy who has given up all undertakings, he is called the one who is beyond the gunas.
Mam chayo vyabhicharena bhakti yogena sevate sagunan samati tyaitan brahma bhuyaya kalpate.
And the one who with unsavouring devotion worships 6 May, he is fit for being Brahman, having properly crossed these gunas.
Brahmano hi pratishtaham amritasya vyayasya cha shashvatasya cha dharmasya sukhasya ikantikasya cha.
I am the basis indeed of Brahman, which is immortal, not subject to change, the eternal dharma, the basis of everything, and which is of the nature of happiness that is not subject to negation.
So verse 23 will answer question 1, which was asked in verse 21. And that question is, what are the characteristics of those who have crossed the 3 gunas? Reading verse, he, she remains indifferent to the 3 guna states, not disturbed by their origination. He wavers not. One's buddhi remains firm, knowing all phenomena belongs to Prakriti. Jnani versus Ajnani comparison. The Ajnani generally goes through 2 conditions. And the first one, that means one who's not wise, who's yet to ascertain the knowledge, goes through either reaction, which is Rajaguna, or through inaction, which is Tamaguna. And these 2 extremes tend to dominate the world. You know, for example, you've got TikTok. Now, TikTok is really interesting, by the way. I was just doing some research. If you look at TikTok, it is basically what? One after the other, right? Videos, like one, next, 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 next. So TikTok did the research. What are people looking for today? Oh, okay. So they want short, compressed, entertaining. Let's give it to them. So you really start to see how what we create is really just a response, in other words, a Rajaguna, on the basis of what the general world is going through. And again, I'll be looking at TikTok. It's like amazing. I didn't know. It just doesn't allow the person to think. It's too short. 30 seconds, boom, next, 30 seconds, next. There's no sense of thinking involved. So you can start to see how it's either reaction, Rajaguna, or it is just next, right? I don't want to think, which is Tamaguna. So Ajnani has 2 these extremes. 1, I either react, and 2, I just have inaction. In other words, I do not want to think, which is inaction. Whereas a Jnani, they remain indifferent. And when I say the word indifferent, that just means holding off to forming opinions. In other words, before I form an opinion, pause, assess, act. In other words, there's a thinking going on before I tend to say something, before I tend to make a conclusion. Others may perceive such a person as cold or unengaging sometimes. This is the extreme version. I don't know if you met some people like that, but it's like, you know, they are like quite firm in their knowledge, but they're generally like unresponsive, right? They just don't want to like deal with you. And it's kind of awkward to be with these folks, right? You like, you want to make friends, and now it's like, there we go. Yeah, that's right. It's like, are you above me? Like, you know, I feel small here. Come, let's be friends. So this is the extreme version. So even, you know, even for this type of fella, right? If the values are not there from chapter 13, accommodation and empathy and right, just listening and being with the person, then it's kind of very awkward to be with that, around that person. Either way, pause, assess, act. This is the nature of the Jnani who has done that, and thus these sattva guna has increased their mind because they're inquiring. Finally, it says in the verse, na ingate na vichalyate. In other words, for that reason alone, pause, assess, act, the Jnani's mind remains in balance. In other words, because they know the inevitability of the gunas constantly undergoing change. Therefore, rather keep your mind balanced and don't overreact and don't be too inactive, knowing that they are ever-changing conditions. So rather remain, quote, indifferent. In other words, before responding or reacting, hey, that's what's going on. Let's respond appropriately. There's a level of intelligence that you're involving versus just go in. Verse 24, question 2 will now be answered, which is, how does he or she conduct oneself in reference to the world or people? Reading. The liberated one sees equal value in pleasure, pain, clod of earth, stone or gold, desirable, undesirable experiences, praised or criticized. Whatever the relationship is with the body, which is changing, fluctuating, that is the same relationship with the world, because the world and the body are not apart. If you take care of your body and you know that the body is not apart from the world, you will naturally want to take care of the world. So this whole thing about go out there and, you know, help, there's no question of that. There's no effort for that, for the one that recognizes this body is not apart from the world. Just like you take care of this body, you know that this body is part of the world. Therefore, naturally, this person wants to contribute to the world. It's just an organic process. In other words, they have a degree of acceptance towards the changes of the world and the body. Okay, they're okay with it. They don't get angry too much or overreactive or totally inactive because it's fluctuating. I'll just give you an example. Inevitably, you will meet a sattvic person, right? Someone that's cheerful, someone that's just clear or, you know, knowledgeable in a certain topic. You will also meet inevitably a rajasic person. They're agitated around you. They give you a hard time. They expect you to do things really fast, or you feel pushed, right? Pushiness, right? You're being pushy. Give me a moment. Let me think. You will also inevitably meet a tamasic person, unengaging, inactive, and not much to say, just like, okay. And you feel like you're doing all the work, right? So you will inevitably meet these three people. And owing to your understanding, you don't anymore focus so much on the character traits, as I said before. You rather focus on the glue that holds both you and them. You focus on that underlying substratum. For example, you're breathing the same air as I am. That's a good start, right? You have a brain, I have a brain. That's another good start, right? So in other words, you're looking for commonalities instead of differences. Oh, they're quiet and I'm talkative. And so there's this huge contrast now, can't get along with it. So in other words, it allows you to find a common ground between us. And that is, we're both governed by these three gunas right now. The way I'm thinking about you, because of the three gunas, the way you're thinking about me, because of the three gunas. There's always a common thread in and through. And it really helps you to have a nice relationship, a real a smooth relationship with people, whereby even if someone's really quiet and they're not saying much, you don't get so much judgmental about them. You say, hey, you know, what can I communicate that we have in common here? And then just revert back to this knowledge. Air, start with air. That's an easy one. Hey, did you know you're breathing air? So am I. So let's talk about that, right? So just an idea. Now, how does the Jnani conduct oneself in reference to things, in reference to objects in this world, because we're always dealing with objects, are we not? Yeah, thoughts, people, news, everything's an object. And again, it is with a balanced state of mind. And that is because one never loses the sight. I am nirgunam. Nirguna means without attributes. My nature is nirgunam, the unchanging. Nothing can tame me. Nothing can spoil myself. Nothing can add or subtract from myself. Everything else is saguna, but I alone, the witness in whose presence the saguna changes are known, I remain pure, intact, free all the time. And constant, unbroken recognition of this understanding, that is what we call in the scriptures moksha. In other words, no matter what happens at any situation, the good, the bad, and the ugly, nice movie, by the way, the unbroken recognition of one's nature as unchanging, nirgunam, is constant. It's never less or more. It's not more tomorrow than it is today, or it was less today than it is today, yesterday than it is today. In other words, it's a constancy about it. Now the verse continues, because of this understanding, sama dukkha sukha, one remains equanimous towards things which have power to produce sorrow and power to produce happiness, general equanimity, general objectivity. Including, the verse continues, sama loshta ashma kanchanaha, including cloud of earth, rock, or gold. Now, if you think today, you say, for example, give me some gold, I want that, right? Or give me a soil, I don't want that, I've got a lot of that. Whereas a Jivanmukta sees them both equally. They're just both from earth, right? The value is that which the society has attributed. It's got nothing to do with what I value, because what I value is, right, the whole. So where's the question of putting the cloud of earth lower or higher than the piece of gold? In other words, the Jivanmukta, recognizing the three gunas are in and through, operating through both the gold and the wood and the soil. Where's the question of putting one higher, putting one lower? You simply deal with them as the situation demands. If I want to cross the river and there's gold in front of me, walk on the gold. Rocks, walk on the rocks, and then let it go. Also because of the three factors, and these three factors are always changing. Deshaha, environment, right? So the environment would dictate what you value at any moment. You go to a country where there's scarcity of food, you will suddenly value food a lot more where there's abundance of food. Kalaha, time. Time is always progressing, and thus time causes us to value different things. And now prarabdha. Prarabdha is the effects of our past causes. These three, deshaha, prarabdha, and kalaha, are constantly governing what we value at any one moment. Thus, why get attached to what we value? In other words, this allows us to have an equanimous state of mind. Furthermore, tulya ninda atma samstutihi, one remains balanced towards criticisms and glorifications. Why? Two reasons. First, can you criticize or blame or glorify consciousness? No. In other words, it's only because I'm conscious that I can criticize consciousness. It's only because of consciousness that I can glorify consciousness. And the Jivanmukta's identity is placed in that consciousness. Thus, any criticism is the criticism of this body, not of me, self, Atman. Second reason is because criticism and glorifications, they're both relative. They're relative based on what the person understands. You go to someone that is yet to learn many things, and they will see you as the greatest thing. But you go to someone else who knows equal to you, then they're not glorifying you as much. In other words, whatever criticisms or glorifications you receive are only relative to how much that person knows. Even Rama criticized, Adi Shankara criticized, Krishna criticized, Yeshua ben Yosef, Jesus criticized. There's not one person, even if they're an avatara, who is not criticized in this world. Now, if an avatara is criticized, then what to say about you and I? In other words, expect it. If you don't have any criticisms, something's probably like, closing yourself off, something. In other words, it's okay to receive because everyone has different ideas, different perceptions because of projecting power. Verse 25, how does he or she conduct oneself in reference to world or people? Reading the verse, Jnani is same in honor and dishonor, towards friend and foe, the renouncer of all actions, knowing the three gunas are the doers and not the self. He, she is beyond the gunas. Mitra ari pakshayoho. The Jnani does not consider anyone an enemy, although others still may find him or see him or perceive him or her as an enemy, because the Jnani, as I just said, sees all things as names and forms of the one content, of the one consciousness. Therefore, where's the question of now enemizing other things? Although it doesn't mean that the Jnani is going to have the same relationship, just like Krishna, different relationship to Arjuna and Duryodhana. But it doesn't mean that they hate, they dwell in their hatred towards Krishna, towards Duryodhana. They're just, dealing whatever needs to be done, but they don't dwell upon it. There was a Prahlada who was enlightened at 5, according to the Puranas. And who was his enemy? Rama had an enemy. Prahlada, enlightened at 5, had an enemy who was Hiranyakashipu. Now, a really interesting story. Hiranyakashipu was really angry with his son, and his son says, yeah, but I see the Lord everywhere. And Hiranyakashipu says, even in that pillar? Yes, even in that pillar. And so Hiranyakashipu goes over and knocks over the pillar. It was like a little temple. And that pillar opens up and it comes out Narasimha Narayana. Narasimha, Nara means man, Simha means lion. In other words, half man, half lion. And Hiranyakashipu got a boon from Brahmaji that he cannot be killed either by a man or an animal, not by weapons, and not day and night. Is there any options left? If he cannot be killed either by a man or an animal during day or night, nor by weapons, how can you be killed? Is there anything in between? Watch this. Now, Narasimha Narayana comes over and says, you're finished, you're toast, I'm going to kill you because you've been doing bad deeds. You've been doing a lot of destructive labor and adharma all over the place. And he's like, no, you cannot kill me. But he still got killed. How? Because he's Narasimha. He's neither man nor animal. It was neither day nor it was night. It was dusk, twilight. And he killed him how? Not with weapons, but with nails. And what's the symbolism of this? Lord, Ishwar, is always one step ahead of you because he is total intelligence. We are limited intelligence. In other words, no matter how one thinks they're smart or intelligent, Ishwar is that one which is the most smart, the most intelligent, the most grandiose, the most wanted, the most beautiful, the most attractive, the most delicious, the most desired. In this case, the most intelligent. Continuing, Sarva Arambha Parityagi, Jnani is the renouncer of all actions. Why? Because number one, the gunas are the doers and not self, the one in whose presence these gunas get to do whatever they get to do. And number two, because people do actions to enjoy, do they not? There's no other reason that you do actions to enjoy. Whereas the Jnani's identity, being placed in itself, the joy of self, knowing one's fullness, nothing in this world, in this mithya world, can top that. Therefore, they no longer apply actions in order for the sake of getting, because simply nothing tops the contentment, the security of knowing oneself as the whole. Thus, there's no need to go out there. In fact, one of the beautiful verses that I find was in chapter 3, verse 22, and Krishna says to Arjuna, Arjuna, I, higher nature, you have to throw that in, I, higher nature, there is nothing for me, the higher nature, for me to accomplish in this world. This is beautiful. There is nothing for me, higher nature, to accomplish in this world. Second line, yet I, lower nature, remain fully engaged, you have to fill in the blanks, for the welfare in this world. Now, see the contradiction? If you remove what we just filled in. First, there is nothing for me to do in this world, and yet I remain fully engaged in this world. That is a beautiful description of a Jivanmukta. In other words, there is nothing for me, the higher, Atman, to accomplish in this world, because I'm the awareness in whose presence everything else is done. And yet I, the body, mind, intellect, the perceiver, the thinker, the feeler, remain fully engaged in this world according to what I'm assigned here to do. This is a wonderful description, chapter 3, verse 22 of a Jivanmukta, which Krishna is. Okay, and then finally, guna titaha. In other words, the Jnani is beyond the three gunas, leading us to verse 26. Verse 26 will answer question 3, which was asked in verse 21, which is, how does one go beyond the 3 gunas? Whoever worships the Lord through unswerving devotion, through course of time, his or her mind becomes fit to grasp the vision of oneness by recognizing the effects of the gunas and not identifying with them. The means to gunatita, in other words, the method to transcending these 3 gunas is avyabhicharena bhakti yogena. So that's an instrumental with bhakti yoga. In other words, bhakti yoga, as discussed in chapter 12, which consists of 5 stages, is the means to gunatitaha, transcending the 3 gunas. And what are these 5 stages? They are not action, because we said the problem is ignorance. Action is only in reference to not having something right now, right here. If I'm hungry, what do? I apply the action of eating. If I'm not happy, what do? I turn on the TV. These are all actions. But the big problem is ignorance. Therefore, there's no question of action because I'm already the self right now. Therefore, the only solution can be removing that ignorance that I'm not the self right now, that I'm not full, whole, and free and complete right now. 5 stages of Bhakti Yoga. So what's the question here? When I say Bhakti Yoga, it really just means 5 steps. Step 1, Karma Yoga level 1. This is whereby you can tell your kids, for example, because their prarabdha karma is still strong, so they're going to do selfish things anyway. So you tell your kids, when you get the results of your selfish actions, you don't say selfish, just when you get the results of your actions, then think of the higher power. Make them think about the higher power. What is involved, the seasons, the other people, the knowledge, your own education, the teachers, the traffic, so many variables were involved to make that happen. That's Karma Yoga level 1. Karma Yoga level 2 is whereby you think of Ishvara not only when you receive something, but also how it is possible to do things right now. In other words, Ishvara is now in and through your actions, but also in and through your results. You think about the laws and orders that are responsible, that are making this happen right now. As I said, air, that's a good one. Always return back to your breath and recognize this person is breathing, the heart is beating, the brain is thinking, the neurons are firing. All of this is now being coordinated by these 3 gunas. Then we have Upasana Yoga level 1. This is whereby you are meditating on a personal God, on a personal object, a meaningful object to you. Upasana Yoga level 2 is whereby the person gets suspicious of focusing on one single object. He says, how can God be only in that object? He must be in many more places. Therefore, now any object becomes the means to meditation. Before it was just one, now anything, nature, the sky, the sunset, the Ganga River, whatever it is, becomes an object of meditation. And that qualifies the mind highly into, primes it for Jnana Yoga. And that is the final stage whereby I remove ignorance that I'm not whole and complete right now. In chapter 7, we also have the Artha Bhakta thinks of Ishvara only when times of distress, right? So something's bad, my son got hurt, my daughter got hurt, I think of Ishvara. Please help them. Artharthi is the second stage. This is whereby one has a constant interaction with the Lord. They're bargaining. I will give donations as long as you keep my family happy. It's good because now at least they're thinking about the Lord more often, right? I will help you. I will teach as long as I get something in return in the future. It is still good for the individual because at least they're still thinking about the Lord all the time. The next stage is Jijinatsu. This is whereby the person gets out of those first 2 stages and they say, hey, I want to know, to whom am I praying? Who is this being that I keep on praying to, right? In other words, Ishvara, give me the knowledge, the clarity, so I may know your nature as you are instead of from my own assumptions. And thus, Artharthi, from Artharthi into Jijinatsu, and thus the person starts to assimilate much grander vision because of what they're asking. So Artha, Artharthi, Jijinatsu, or Jijnasu. So these are the 3 stages. Going through these 5 levels, what happens? Brahma bhuyaya kalpate. He or she becomes eligible to remove false notions. His or her mind becomes eligible to ascertain this vision and hold it permanently. And finally, verse 27, I am the basis of everything. So Krishna is saying to Arjuna here that, hey, Arjuna, I'm the very Brahman that you are seeking, that you're attempting to reach, facing you right now. And my nature is uncontradictable. Can you contradict consciousness? Can you contradict awareness? No, because to contradict awareness, you still have to be aware to contradict it. Right? In other words, you cannot never be aware. Otherwise, who's there to be aware of the fact that there is a contradiction? Whose nature is universal. You go to Antarctica, the Inuits. You go to, the Incas, the Mayans, the Egyptians, any civilization. What is one thing in common? It's not knowledge. It's not what we know. It's not our architecture. It's not our art. It is not our language. It is nothing about external. There is only one thing in common. We're all conscious. We're all conscious beings. Therefore, that alone is universal, and whose nature is non-negatable. You cannot negate consciousness, because if you were to negate consciousness, I would just ask you, well, how are you conscious about the fact that you've negated consciousness? In other words, you cannot negate yourself. You cannot negate existence. Krishna, out of compassion, has come into the Jiva form to let us know this message. And therefore, this message always remains true. That's how the Vedas are. They're considered the eternal texts. Because out of compassion, Ishvara comes in a form of a Jiva and says, hey, let me enlighten those who are seeking to get out of this cycle of samsara. Let me help those who are willing to listen, right? So in other words, people go through stages and eventually they say, what's the point of this? What's the point of just browsing mindlessly through things and watching news and this and that? And thus they finally find this knowledge, because Ishvara is the all-knowing being who thinks in the past, present, and the future. And thus, because of that, he says, maybe in 10 million years from now, someone's going to be desiring me. So let me create that knowledge now. At the beginningless beginning, thus the Vedas gets created in the form of our scriptures. Finally, the only way to reach me, says Krishna, is when these four factors converge. And they have to converge by living how? With what we call Sanatana Dharma, universal harmony with the whole, with your environment, with the people that you're with. And thus these four come: your own effort, Ishvara's grace, the guru, and the methodology. And they converge at the perfect timing, thus enlightening the person's mind from thinking that they are not complete, that they are not full. What ensues from this? An attitudinal change born of understanding that these gunas are doing their work in my presence alone. Sarve bhavantu sukhinaha, sarve santu niramayaha, sarve bhadrani pashyantu, ma kaschid dukkha bhag bhavet. Om Shanti, Shanti, Shanti.